Hazel Collins was very good at controlling things. Courtroom cadence, client briefings, the precise angle of a closing argument so that juries felt nudged rather than pushed. She could, with the same efficient calm, make a flight, a briefcase, and a tiny apartment in the city seem like decisions made by someone who never panicked. The one thing that unspooled her, faster than a subpoena or an anxious judge, was her mother's voice on speaker, patient and impossible, asking, in that way only mothers can, "Are you bringing someone this year?" The question lodged like a fishbone. It wasn't the content, it was the shape of it. Hazel could manage contracts with crooked clauses and clients who lied like it was the weather. But she could not, she thought, manage the collective pity that seemed to descend whenever family came up. In her mother's voice, there was more than curiosity. There was a small, sorrowing assessment, a subtler disapproval. Success as an exterior, loneliness as an interior. Hazel was 30 minutes from a grocery store that sold boxed cheesecake for the holidays, and she was already composing answers in her head that would sound transparent and tidy. She didn't expect to collide with the man. It happened in the canned goods aisle, beneath tired fluorescent lights and a looping, badly recorded Christmas playlist that only seemed to know one half of one carol. Hazel had her phone tucked between jaw and shoulder as she argued down the line about seating arrangements. A cart wobbling with last-minute life, cranberry sauce, coffee enough for 2 households, and a box of artisanal marshmallows she'd bought for stealth reasons, because in the old telling of herself, she could never refuse marshmallows. The cart in front of her stopped dead. She didn't spot the man until the cart hit hers hard enough to shove the stack of marshmallows into the air. They burst like a soft white comet over the polished linoleum, and a pair of hands reached to steady the cart and to catch the scattered parachute of confection. He was taller than she expected and wore a coat that might have swallowed lesser people whole. Long, black, tailored to a shoulder that declared, quietly, that it was used to being leaned on. His hair was cropped short in a way that suggested careful thought rather than fashion. The smell that hit Hazel first, before his face formed whole in her vision, was something like cedar and smoke and something just a little exotic, the kind of scent you notice in a bookshop when someone has been reading by a fire. He moved with the economy of someone used to staying out of trouble and also, perhaps, used to clearing it away. "Sorry." He said it like it was an understatement, not the embarrassed chorus of most grocery store apologies, but a small, measured thing that made the aisles feel suddenly hush. They both bent, hands meeting in the marshmallow middle, and Hazel felt that ridiculous lurch. How often did 2 strangers' hands end up in the same suite? It should have been a comedic blip. Instead, she found herself looking into eyes that weren't so much dark as unreadable, like pages someone had gone through and then reclosed. "I'm Hazel," she said, the reflex of introduction, the automatic politeness you'd find at the margins of human collisions. "Brandon." His accent, if it could be called that, was flat, American, but threaded with a quality her brain insisted on labeling cinematic. "Hazel," he said again, like he was checking the name against a list, and then his mouth quirked. "You're not from here." She'd never wanted to argue that point more. "I live in the city," she said, which was true. "I'm visiting." He straightened, released his hold on the cart, and, impossibly, plucked a marshmallow out of the air with an elegance that made Hazel suddenly think of magicians who hit things on purpose. He popped it into his mouth and watched her over it. The warehouse lights made tiny stars of dust on the top of his coat. Her mother's question was vibrating somewhere behind her temple, ready to spill. "Do you have plans for the holidays?" the man asked, which was either grocery store chit-chat or a surprisingly forward inquiry into her family life. She had, at that exact moment, no good answer. She began, and then the phone in her ear blurred into static where her mother's voice asked, "Who's driving? Will you be okay on your own? Hazel, I was thinking." The man tilted his head toward her phone. "Family?" "Exactly," she said. The word felt heavier than it should. "Family." He gave a small, almost conspiratorial smile. the kind that suggested he took a dark pleasure in small rebellions. "Tell me something absurd," he said. "That will make your mother stop." She blanked. "Like what? That I've become a secret pie taster for the Department of Justice?" "Something more immediate." He leaned in, lowering his voice so the sound of it was a private thing only for her ear. "Pretend you're with me." The phrase landed in her like someone reaching into her pocket and finding the small, private list she'd been keeping of what she avoided. It shouldn't have had power, being no more than a suggestion, but the whisper was edged with something that felt not quite safe and not quite frightening, like stepping toward a locked gate and feeling the key in your palm. "Excuse me?" Hazel's mouth closed around the disbelief before the world could correct it into laughing. "Come home with me," he said, plainly. "I'll be your boyfriend. I'll look like a—" He searched for the phrase, then shrugged as if titles were trivial. "I'll be your distraction. There will be no romance. There will be a performance. At midnight on Christmas, you walk back into the world you usually keep. No permanent confusion." "No." He paused, as if listing terms to keep a contract tidy. Hazel could hear the careful count of his words like a ledger. He spoke as if this were a business proposition, which, if you put it like that, with a signature, a clearly circled end date, was almost more credible than the free-floating pity of family dinners. For a person who measured life in deadlines and brief sentences, the offer had a strange logic. No one in a grocery store should be offering to be someone's fake boyfriend, and yet the absurdity sat next to something reasonable. Here was a man who proposed to dress the role and walk into a living room full of Aunt Carols and aunts who judge like gentle senators. Here was a man who spoke of an expiration date as if it were a promise. Hazel should have laughed. Instead, a corner of her brain that cataloged risk began a rapid tally. She could imagine the alternatives. Telling her mother she was single, watching her mother's eyes bloom sympathy like bad light, listening to the inevitable suggestions about apps and dinners and the cousin 2 towns over who could set her up with someone nice. The thought of those next 48 hours felt suffocating. "Why would you," she started, because the question had to be aired, "why would you do that for a stranger?" Brandon's mouth made a small, unreadable line. "Because I like complicated opportunities," he said, "and because I appreciate theatrics." He was almost smiling. He did not look like a man interested in small talk. There was a hush about his movements, the way he folded his hands over the cart as if the world were inclined to obey him, or at least to pause. There was a quality in his presence that made other people step aside, not with fear exactly, but with a certain respect, a rearranging of their expectations of normal behavior. Hazel, briefly, thought of characters in whispered stories at the edges of towns, men whose names were said in combination with other hushed phrases. She filed the observation away. It felt heavy enough to keep, like a stone in a pocket. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No catch." He said it as if he were offering the truth and an invitation to believe. "Just a performance. 1 week. No entanglements. I pay for the groceries. I tell stories at the table so your relatives actually talk to each other. At midnight," he glanced at his watch with a theatrical sigh, "I am gone." Hazel thought of midnight on Christmas as a ritual in itself, a small, tidy thing she could return to the city with. An expiration date that was as exact as any deadline she wrote. She thought of her mother, of the way pity unfurled across her face, the way Nancy's boys had been described on the phone. Mischievous but sweet, like a parent listing alarm lights. She thought of the months of solo dinners she had, chefs on TV giving her recipes for what seemed to be desperate people, and the way a relationship could be a long grade paper that graded one instead of teaching. "What's your name?" she asked, the question a test. "Brandon," he said again, and there was a small sturdiness to the way he said it, as if the name had been carefully chosen and then polished with a quiet hand. "Brandon Moretti." Moretti. The mouth named a suggestion of origin and a thing that didn't quite fit with his plain American tenor. It had the sound of stories, of old houses, of men whose names were said in rounded syllables at the edge of the family. Hazel filed the name with the rest of his particularities: the coat that swallowed, the cedar smoke scent, the way his eyes didn't smile but seemed to watch joy like a thing that could be measured. She could have said no. She could have walked free. Instead, she imagined, with a sudden brightness, the scenario he offered: the sharpness of a lie so small it felt like a bandage, the way the family would relax, the way her mother's face would soften in a way that was almost enough. Hazel had written contracts for living people and dead corporations. She knew what language could do to pain. She pictured herself at the center of a living room that didn't whisper at her, a tableau in which she wasn't the object of the punchline. "Fine," she said finally, "but it's a performance, and I want it in writing." Brandon laughed once, a sound that slipped under the store's fluorescent mercy. "Of course you do," he murmured. "You're a lawyer." They sat on a folding chair in the bakery aisle for a ridiculous 5 minutes, while Hazel, impossibly, dictated terms: a clear expiration at midnight on December 25th, no unexpected social media co-tagging, a clause about no interviews, and, most importantly to her, no researching my life without consent. Brandon listened, pen poised, as if to jot down each term with the same gravity she'd assigned to a power of attorney. "Signature?" he asked when they were done. He produced a slim leather wallet and a fountain pen. Hazel noted the flash of his cuff as if cataloging yet another incongruity. He signed in a hand that was spare, precise, a small confirmation of something that felt like surrender and rebellion at the same time. She signed back, her own name performed in a tidy sweep, agreement not to the grandness of it, but to the temporary honesty of it. They swapped the contract like children trading notes. It was absurd. It was likely safe in the way any staged performance can be safe if both parties keep the same script. Hazel felt a peculiar surge, part fear, part exhilaration, as if stepping onto a small raft and trusting someone else to paddle. Her mother would be mollified, the family rituals reinstated. The thought was almost comforting. "What's the plan for getting there?" she asked. Practical as always.
"I have a car," Brandon said. "Black. We'll leave tomorrow morning. Bring sensible boots." When she left the grocery store, she felt as if she'd stepped out of a dream staged under poor lighting. She could have laughed at herself. Instead, she busied herself with the tasks that kept her determined. She made a list for the ride home, she texted Nancy in a way that would sound casual and competent, and she tucked the half contract into the inside pocket of her coat like a contraband talisman. Back in her high-rise apartment, the city was a grid of immaculate lights and indifferent honking. Her place smelled faintly of takeout and paper. She sat at her little kitchen table with the contract spread out in front of her like a legal puzzle. Hazel prided herself on precision. Contracts were her comfort, their ink, the way one clause leaned into another to form a fortress. This one, though, made a strange kind of architecture. A door, labeled performance, that could be opened and closed. She revised the text with the pedantic satisfaction of someone making rules for a game. There were clauses nobody needed but lawyers. There was a clause that forbade him from bringing up anything from her past without express permission during family dinners. A clause required him to participate in any planned group photos without complicating poses. There was a privacy clause that read like a promise to keep the illusion clean. In a final flourish, she added one provision that made her stomach do the small, unfamiliar flip of uncontrolled possibility. An emergency clause, stipulating that if either of them experienced a real emotional breach, they would call a timeout and speak truth. No more performances in the face of real pain. When she read that line, the apartment felt suddenly too small for all the things it had to contain. She was almost 30. She had a job that defined her, a life of precise choices. Yet she had, like a bad habit, stayed in the margins of something warmer. She remembered, absurdly, the way she had drawn as a child. Pencil smudges along knuckles, an awful rhythm. The way her father would bring home paper from the office and she'd draw houses that were too small for their chimneys. The drawings had been private rebellions, little glimpses into a life she had not yet authorized herself to choose. Her phone buzzed. Nancy, bring marshmallows and don't let the twins squirt maple syrup into the DVD player this year. A laugh slipped out of Hazel despite herself. She folded the contract, she placed it into an envelope as if readying a confession. When she slid it into her bag, the envelope felt like a single honest object in a season of expectant illusions. Before she slept that night, a sleep that came with the kind of anxious energy you get before a major motion, she wrote a small note and tucked it into her coat pocket. Be brave, but keep your boundaries. It was the adult equivalent of a flashlight in a cave.
The next morning, the car Brandon promised was exactly as he had described. Black, low, the kind that didn't clang down driveways but considered them. He was already there when she slipped onto the cabin seat, his figure outlined against the driver's window like someone who was exactly where they'd intended to be for a long time. "Your bags?" he asked in the curiously quiet voice that had been a thread through the grocery store. She handed him an overnight bag, the small paper envelope with the contract tucked inside it like a talisman, and for a moment their hands brushed. There was no jolt, no cinematic electricity, and yet Hazel felt the almost imperceptible shift that comes when strangers agree to complicity. They were now partners in a small deception, and partners have to be competent. The drive out of the city peeled away in a familiar geometry. Highway, rustling suburbs, the small towns with their boarded shops and tasteful Christmas wreaths. Brandon drove with a focused economy, hands placed on the wheel as if he were playing a piece of music only he could hear. He occasionally flicked a glance at Hazel, not invasive, not like someone reading file margins, but appraising, as if estimating the amount of time a particular candle could safely burn. She watched the city shrink in the rear view, the glass towers yielding to the softer geometric shapes of farmland. The air smelled different here, pine, earth, the cold metallic tang that comes before snow. Hazel felt the walls she kicked around herself, a steady architecture of competence, slowly, hardly perceptibly, loosen at the corners. There was a relief in the unglossed landscape, in a horizon unlit by office towers. "You're quiet," Brandon observed at one point. It was almost an accusation and also a note of curiosity. He had a way of making statements that invited explanation but did not demand it. "I run on an internal monologue," she said, which was something half likely to be true and half a reflexive attempt to deflect. He smiled, which changed his face the way a shadow can change a landscape. "Do you still draw?" he asked, as if remembering a detail one should know. She blinked at him. "When I was small," she admitted. "Pencil smudges until my mother made me stop. She said a lawyer shouldn't have ink on her fingers." "She was wrong," he said. It was a small, offhand thing that felt like a bridge. Hazel discovered suddenly that she wanted to tell this stranger small things. How her father would whistle to himself while he stacked firewood. How her mother kept cinnamon sticks in a jar and called them incentives. How Nancy had married somebody who laughed at the right seconds and had produced twins who understood 100 small ways to be disruptive. They drove through a gray afternoon that softened into the kind of light the countryside does in winter. The black SUV slid down the lane up to the Collins farmhouse as if it had been designed to appear in these yards and these driveways. The gravel spoke under its tires, the porch light blinked, and there were the warm, woven scents of wood smoke and baking rising in a greeting. Hazel's mother's face was all cinnamon and softness and the tiny, complicated warmth of a person relieved to see the thing they have wished for. "Hazel, oh," she murmured, folding her daughter into an embrace that smelled of laundry soap and the faint tang of perfume Mrs. Collins never wore in the city. When she saw Brandon, she arched an eyebrow, and then, in the way of mothers confronting the unfamiliar, she laid a hand on his arm. "Well, you're practically headline-worthy, aren't you?" He inclined his head toward her with a formal courtesy that didn't pretend at being modest. "Hazel asked me to be her date." "You're very kind," Mrs. Collins said, and there was an honest gratitude there that made Hazel feel oddly protected. For the first time in months, the pressure pulled back by a notch. The farm had its old ways, and one of them was a quickness to forgive a table performance. Nancy arrived with the twins in a flurry, Connor and Nolan like small, identical sons of energy, dragging a small red sled behind them. They were dusted with the kind of daring that comes from small bones and big imaginations. Hazel watched Brandon crouch to their level and toss a small grin their way. He didn't soften like a television protector. He altered the room's temperature a degree, and the boys declared him a friend. "Are you staying for dinner? Aunt Carol will want to make room," Nancy said, and the twins tumbled words and questions. "Are you really a spy? Do you have a cape? Can we have marshmallows?" Brandon smiled, and something in the way he took the boys' energy, turning it into stories and small games, made Hazel's chest do the odd, surprised thing of unfurling. He listened to the boys as if their stories mattered, retelling them in little dramatic embellishments that made the twins laugh, and Violet, Mrs. Collins' neighbor, who had come in with seasoned casserole, stare like she'd just remembered the punchline of a joke and was pleased. There was a small, ceremonial interrogation at the dinner table. Aunt Carol, Aunt Susan, distant cousins who had worked at the textile mill, and the local pastor who had known Hazel since she was a child. Hazel fielded questions with the same efficiency she used for legal cross-examination, but Brandon, mysterious and quiet, had an effect that made the cousins relax into a rhythm they had not managed in years. He was not talkative in the way of someone trying to be affable. He was quietly present, a piece of furniture that warmed a room. Hazel found herself watching him more than she wanted to. At times, he was almost painfully still, listening to stories like they were documents being examined for truth. At other moments, he moved with a startling tenderness. He carved the turkey with the care of someone handling something fragile, brushed flour from a child's forehead with the precision of a practiced hand. The house accepted him like a newcomer who had the manners to ask first, not the arrogance to assume. That night, the twins led a brigade of sticky-fingered conspirators to the kitchen. The holiday baking had been a family plan. Sugar cookies cut into the shapes of stars and stockings, the old family rolling pin that belonged to Hazel's grandmother, and, because the Collinses did not know the concept too much sweetness, a mountain of powdered sugar and flour and cinnamon that looked exactly like a modernist snow globe had collapsed on the counter. Hazel loved the kitchen in a secret way she rarely allowed to breathe. In the city, she cooked with the same measured economy she applied to cases. Here, in the thick, laughing chaos of the Collins kitchen, she could let her wrists loosen. The twins were a blur of motion and mischief. Aunt Carol was right behind them with a wooden spoon and the kind of scolding that meant, "You're allowed," and Brandon leaned against the counter watching the transformation of the room like someone studying a map. It began with a gentle skirmish, a rogue handful of flour thrown at an elbow, a malicious application of cinnamon to the nose of an unsuspecting aunt, and then, like the opening of a dam, the kitchen exploded in a flurry of white and sugar and laughter. Hazel found herself smiling in a way that made the line in her jaw smooth out. She flicked powdered sugar onto Brandon's sleeve, and then, to her own surprise, he flicked back. His retaliatory sprinkle was a slow, precise thing. It landed like a scattered constellation across the lapel of his coat. He moved as if he were conducting an orchestra where every instrument was an accusation of playfulness. The twins cheered, Aunt Carol dissolved into delighted shrieks, and even Nancy, who managed the chaos with the patience of someone who had two small people to raise, allowed herself to be draped in a cloud of sugar. There is a particular kind of domestic warfare that turns into something like joy, a sort of holy mischief. And Hazel surrendered to it. She grabbed a bag of powdered sugar and with serious intent flung it in Brandon's direction. It bloomed like a ghost of winter, and his grin, brief, almost reluctant, was the closest thing to happiness Hazel had seen from him. He shook his hand like a man wiping fingerprints from a valuable artifact, and then, surprising everyone, he joined the twins in constructing a small, filmy mountain of sugar and cinnamon cookies. The kitchen was a riot of scent and texture. The sharp perfume of citrus peels tossed into a pot simmering on the stove, the heavy, comforting smell of roasting turkey, sugar dusting everything like early, sloppy snow. Hazel's hands were covered in flour. Her dress, a soft corduroy she'd chosen for its urban practicality, was spattered with sugary evidence of her new choice to be messy. For a suspended, brilliant moment, she forgot the careful compartments she'd built for sorrow and performance and law. She laughed until her sides hurt. Aunt Carol, watching from the doorway with her soft cardigan and the permanent glint of kindness in her eye, started to clap. The sound was a small, private benediction. "Well," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on a dish towel, "look at this. You two might actually be dangerous together." Brandon inclined his head toward Hazel with a gravity that made the room tilt. He had, for the entire evening, been an enigma, someone who could enter a home and, by being strangely himself, make the home's quiet bursts of warmth more visible. Now he laughed, and it was low and warm and fit the space like a borrowed instrument. Hazel felt the feeling she thought she'd fenced off for good. Not love, not that enormous, dramatic thing people wrote sonnets about, but something softer and more alarming. Possibility. It arrived with the full absurdity of the night. Sugar in the air, a house singing with voices, the twins declaring themselves the judges of whether the cookies were presentable or art, Aunt Carol asking for seconds, and Brandon sitting, for a rare moment, unarmored. When the battle waned and the kitchen settled into the comfortable chaos of a ship at rest, someone, she couldn't remember who, produced a string of mistletoe from a box like a relic. It was a small theatrical prop in a living tableau. Someone draped it above the doorway, and for a second, everyone forgot about stagecraft and played as if childhood rules still held. Hazel found herself near the doorway, the mistletoe precariously swinging above. The twins, sensing spectacle, started a chorus of "Mistletoe! Mistletoe!" sounding like two small-town criers. Brandon stood a few feet away, flour dusting his cuff like frost. They stared at each other, and the room held its breath, not because anyone demanded it, but because the simplest of acts, a kiss, can make the world seem honest for a while. Hazel thought of the contract pinned in her coat pocket, of the expiration written in neat ink. She thought of midnight and the tidy, promised end to this small stage. Brandon's mouth was a small line, not smiling entirely. Then he leaned in, not dramatically, but with the same measured economy he had used in everything else. Precise, consensual, a motion calculated to fit the scene without dragging them into something endless. Their lips met for a breath. No fanfare, only the quiet, inevitable alignment of two people who had found themselves in a shared script. When they parted, there was laughter, and Aunt Carol made a small, approving sound, like someone who'd seen a minor miracle. Hazel's heart was both lighter and stranger. She felt the small, unscripted bloom of something that could complicate her precise life. Brandon's eyes were on her then, steady as a lighthouse beam. Something flashed in them, a small, unspoken thing that made Hazel's chest catch, the suggestion that the performance had cracked a little. He folded his hands, and for a moment, the dangerous quiet tightened around him like fog. Hazel wondered, with that sudden animal quickness people have about threats and tenderness, what lay behind the stillness. A small domestic crisis intervened. A tray of cookies toppled to the floor, and the twins, in a flurry of heroic rescue, pushed aside, squealing. The room erupted into orchestrated noise, and the spell dispersed into grateful laughter. Someone offered brandy, someone else declared it time for carols, and the house once more belonged to its old, private, forgiving rhythms. Hazel felt, in the tilt of her shoulders and the sugar under her nails, a new kind of exhaustion, a sweet, contented fatigue that felt like the correct punishment for a week she had been mercilessly controlling. She looked at Brandon across the room and tried to pin down the impression he made on her. Not quite sinister, not exactly safe, a man who held the shape of a story she had read in the margins. He had an aura of something unwritten and perhaps dangerous. Yes, but it was a danger the house had begun to like an old dog who knew the layout of the furniture. He had a presence that made people listen to each other again. As the night wound down, Hazel stood on the porch for a few minutes alone, the cold air cutting across her cheeks. She watched smoke thread up from the chimney and thought about how tight the city felt now with its fluorescent good intentions. Behind her, laughter leaked from the kitchen and the sound made a soft, steady drum against the dark. Brandon joined her on the porch, the click of his steps a measured approach. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood beside her, the world held between them like a page. "You were very convincing," he said finally, his breath a small cloud that drifted between them. Hazel turned to him, amused despite herself. "I'm a professional," she answered. He inclined his head. "What's it like," he asked, almost conversational, "to keep everything in order, to have the rules do your managing for you?" The question took her by surprise, because he had asked it not as a judge, but as someone genuinely curious, which was both unnerving and oddly tender. Hazel thought of contracts, of clauses that kept people tidy. She found herself answering in a way she rarely did, honest and surprising. "It's lonely," she said, because honesty felt like simplifying. It works until it doesn't. Then you wake up and the rules are just paper. He was silent for a beat. She could feel something shifting in him, like a weight settling. He coughed softly and said, "Performance works for a night." Real life is less kind to scripts. She looked at him, wanting to probe this strange man who moved in a space between rumor and reality. On impulse, she asked one thing that had been nudging at the back of her mind. Are you really the type people whisper about?" The whisper was small and tentative, like testing a fence post. He gave an almost imperceptible smile. "People like to name what they don't understand," he said. "If that means I come with an aura, so be it." The door from the house opened behind them, like the world had decided it was time to tolerate a little more truth. The twins tumbled out, yawns wide and faces dusty with sugar. Mrs. Collins, with her hands full of blankets, looked at them like someone who had been given a wild, fragile present. "Come in," she said to the porch like the night's benediction. "There's a couch with your name on it, Brandon Moretti." He accepted the invitation with the small gravity of a man who knew how to enter a room and how to leave quietly. Hazel watched him step back into the warmth and thought, with a curious clarity, that she had chosen something reckless and likely to be complicated. The contract in her pocket felt heavier now. Inside, the living room had folded itself into the comfortable hubbub of a family that knew how to be loud without being cruel. Hazel sank into a chair and let the sweetness of the kitchen linger in a small, satisfying ache. She felt strangely at peace with her decision and alarmed by the novelty of it. She fell asleep that night with the window cracked open, listening to the wind and the faint, contented murmurs of the extended family. The contract rested in the blazer she had hung on the chair back, its paper crisp and certain. It was, she thought, the oddest kind of comfort, a promise of a performance, an expiry date that could be counted to the minute. There was something else, too, beneath the hum of holiday happiness, the idea that she had allowed herself to be less precise than usual, to be messy in the presence of strangers, and to find, absurdly, that prison walls sometimes open when you hand someone the key to behave well for you. The thought hovered like a moth near a porch light. She didn't know what it meant. For the first time in a long time, she was willing to see. Outside, the farmhouse settled into the night with all the assuredness of things that have stood for decades. Inside, the house hummed with stories and the new wrinkle of Brandon's presence. Hazel clutched a mug of tea as sleep took her, and in the back of her mind a small, insistent notion began. Contracts can be written, but people, messy, unpredictable, insisting things, were a different category entirely. If this story is finding you on a quiet evening, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know who keeps their holiday traditions and who invents new ones. The morning light found the farmhouse dusted in a soft, patient powdering of snow. Hazel woke to the sound of boots on the porch and someone humming an old carol under their breath. The kitchen, in daylight, looked like the aftermath of some benevolent storm. Dough streaked across the countertops, cookie cutters arranged like fallen soldiers, a saucepan with the faint evidence of spilled glaze cooling on the stove. Brandon was at the sink, hands deep in sudsy water, his sleeves rolled up to reveal a forearm that carried the small map of a life hardened and softened in exact equal measures. He was humming, a private thing, and he looked up when Hazel entered. For a second, he looked younger, an image she had not yet catalogued, and then he smiled, small and knowing, like someone who had rehearsed civility and then found it genuine. "You sleep well?" he asked. "Like a log," she admitted, which is rich coming from someone who manages to make a grocery store feel dramatic. A tiny smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I do what I can," he said. He took a tray of cookies from the oven with an almost tender movement and set them out to cool. For all his air of reserved authority, there was something domestic in him now, in the apron he had borrowed to keep his coat clean, in the way he slid a plate of cookies toward the twins like a careful diplomat. Throughout the morning, the farm came alive with the sort of small chaos families were built on. The twins testing the limits of every hay bale within earshot, Nancy plotting a snowman with architectural fervor, Aunt Susan bringing out a secret family tree that prompted nostalgic exclamations and a flood of old stories. Hazel felt the benchmarks of her city life blending, messy, sometimes jarring, but warm in the way of old wood, into something that felt oddly like home. Occasionally, she caught Brandon watching her, not with clinical distance, but with an interest that leaned towards something kinder. He wasn't intrusive, he simply paid attention, as if cataloging small behaviors. The way she rolled her shoulders when she relaxed, how she would click her tongue against her teeth when considering a difficult question, how her laugh, when it came freely, reshaped the room. At one point, he took out a small notebook and sketched just a line or two, and when she gave him a look, he flipped the pad toward her. A small, loose house rested on the page, the lines not perfect, but honest. Hazel felt an odd flutter of recognition. "You draw," she said, more surprised than she expected. He shrugged. "At times," he said. "People have to keep things alive in some way." She thought of her own childhood drawings, the cheap paper, her father's office supplies. She felt suddenly like she could share that small corner of herself with him, and that the man whose presence had been an enigma would not take it as a trophy. The day moved on, a series of small, pleasantly choreographed events. They cut down a tree. Nancy insisted on doing it herself, though there were hints she might prefer the sentimental fantasy. They decorated, laden with mismatched ornaments that clinked and told stories. Brandon moved through these scenes like someone who had read the instructions and then made them his own. He hung an ornament with a delicacy that made Hazel watch him the way one watches someone handle a fragile inheritance. There were small moments of ordinary magic, the twins finding a hidden stash of nuts and declaring them treasure, Aunt Carol teaching everyone a familiar carol with a voice that had softened with age, Mrs. Collins bringing out the long-lost star that only worked if you pressed it gently and believed. The farmhouse felt like a living thing, and Hazel, despite herself, felt knit into it. When evening fell, the family gathered around the big table for a dinner that was as much about the stories as the food. Brandon sat across from Hazel, and for a long minute nothing else mattered. The clatters of silver, the soft exhale of someone turning a page to an old story, the twins' muffled giggles as they traded cookie crumb confessions. He watched her eat, the very small movements she made when she relaxed, the way her shoulders lowered, the little dip of concentration she used when considering a question, the laugh that came up from somewhere private and bright. It was a small catalog of domestic details, and to him, who had spent years measuring men by the shape of their exits, it felt startlingly intimate. Aunt Carol stood and lifted her glass, a familiar ritual that called the room to attention. "To family," she said, voice warm and slightly cracked in the most familiar of ways. "To surprises, and to the people we let into the house." The toast landed like a benediction. Faces softened, hands reached, and for a breath, the room looked like it had been painted with the same forgiving brushstrokes. When the glasses settled back on plates, Brandon cleared his throat, the sort of discreet interruption that suggested he preferred to make remarks that were short but considered. "To honesty," he said, and the words folded into the room like a comfortable, unexpected gift. He looked at Hazel then, his regard unembellished, as if naming honesty aloud made whatever they were doing less fragile. The rest of the night threaded itself into small acts of care. They sang badly but passionately, told stories that the house had heard so many times it hummed along like an old radio, and the twins attempted to construct a sleepy army of stuffed animals around the hearth. After the children were tucked into the spare room with whispered conspiracies and promises of marshmallow-driven midnight raids, a hush settled over the house that belonged exclusively to grown-up things: confessions, the wiping of plates, the quiet measurement of how much one could give without losing themselves. Hazel found herself on the porch again later, a steaming mug in both hands to warm them. The air had that clean, sharp winter bite that made every nerve feel more alert. The sky was a black silk pinned with unfamiliar stars. Brandon joined her without announcement, the sound of his steps swallowed by the snow. He leaned against the railing, shoulders relaxed in a way that looked almost vulnerable in the dim light. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked after a moment, voice small against the night's hush. "Miss what?" Hazel replied. Her question was both literal and a gentle prod at whatever fraction of him had spoken. "Control." His fingers traced the rim of his mug. "The layout of a life you can plan to the minute." She thought of legal briefs, red pens, the way she scheduled comfort the same way other people scheduled meetings. "Sometimes," she admitted, "it feels like safety, and sometimes it feels like a hedge that grows around you." He nodded, as if she'd given him permission to name a fear he'd been nursing. There was something about his silhouette against the porch light, broad shoulders softened by the night, that made confession easier for both of them. "I used to believe that safety was a matter of arrangements," he said slowly. "You plan, you prepare, you protect. You make sure nothing—" He faltered, the sentence breaking on a place he was careful not to speak of in public rooms. Hazel eased closer without thinking, the movement a small resonance of the trust the house had been offering all evening. "What happened?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer would be a drama she had no scripts for. He closed his eyes briefly, the line of his jaw tightening as if he could hold the words behind it. "A long time ago, my life burned," he said finally. "Not in the dramatic, cinematic way people imagine, no wild chases or black-suited men, but in a more private one. There was a night that taught me the difference between being in charge and being helpless. People I loved were taken, gone, in a way that left me full of questions and very small answers." Hazel heard everything in his voice, the unadorned facts and the things he did not say. There was no grand cinematic guilt in it, no romanticized outlaw narrative. It was grief stripped to its bones, the weight of survivors, the shrapnel of what remains after fire eats the rest. "You were there?" she asked, because asking felt less like prying and more like offering him a place to put the memory. "I was," he said simply. "And I realized then that a life built of plans can still be shattered by a single careless moment. I learned to be decisive afterward, almost too decisive, until decisiveness became a shelter more than a tool." "You shouldn't have had to be that alone," Hazel said. She had the odd, brave way of lawyers, to state the obvious when it frightened both parties. No one should. He was quiet for a long heartbeat, watching the steam from their mugs thicken and dissolve. "I built walls," he admitted. "Not out of malice, but out of necessity. But walls can become prisons." That night, and here his voice went softer, "I promised myself I would never rely on people who would only fill rooms with applause. I wanted people who would stay when things got messy." Hazel's hand found his, unplanned, an offering that surprised her as much as it did him. His fingers were warm, calloused in a way that suggested practical labor, and maybe a misused life. He did not withdraw. He closed his hand around hers in a slow, almost ceremonial confirmation, as if he too recognized the small risk in belonging. "What scares you now?" she asked, because she knew the answer wasn't simply fire or loss. It was the fear that had followed him from that night into his polished coat and careful smile. "Being forgettable," he said, "and becoming someone who only knows how to perform safety. There are lives you can run as businesses, calculate, insure, repeat. But there are other things, art, laughter, letting the kids throw powdered sugar like confetti, that won't file neatly anywhere. I think I was afraid I'd lost the ability to live like that." She thought of the cookie dust still stuck to the boy's hair, of Aunt Carol's unsteady clapping, of the way the house had forgiven him quickly and without interrogation. The idea that someone who cultivated such careful distance could, in private, yearn to be less guarded was quietly disarming. "You're not forgettable," she said, and there was something like certainty in it, not the legal kind, but the human one. "You made a room sing tonight." He smiled then, just a small tilt that made him look both weary and a little lighter. "Performance can be contagious," he said. "But I wonder sometimes if I am the one who needs to be performed for." They sat like that for a while, hands linked, talking in fits about trivial things, childhood nicknames, the absurd way the twins hid in laundry baskets as if they were invisible, and then, inevitably, about the contract. The paper sat in the blazer in the spare room. It was both a shield and a map. It had been a tidy solution, a way to pass her mother's invasive questions with a bandage of fiction. But now that the fiction had softened into something else, the crisp edge of the contract felt both protective and painfully limited. "We agreed to midnight," Hazel whispered at some point, as if the time itself were a living thing that might eavesdrop. "We don't have to break the terms," Brandon finished for her. His voice held no admonishment, only the care of a man who had learned the discipline of keeping promises. "We honored the deal we made. It was simple, and sometimes simple is honest. But contracts don't always contain what happens between two people outside of them." She thought of signatures, of clauses, of the way law could be a mercy in messy situations. And yet, there was a soft panic that skittered in her chest, an anxiety about the clock and about the possibility that their performance would evaporate at midnight like fog. They were both, in their own ways, people who preferred firm lines. To allow an exception felt like walking a tightrope without a net. "Promise me one thing," she said, suddenly. "If we cross a line that matters, if either of us starts to feel something real, we call it. No pretending." He did not hesitate. "Deal," he said, and his hand squeezed hers, a small seal. They spent the rest of the evening with the kind of careful joy that comes from knowing something good is temporary and therefore more urgent. At 11:55, the house brightened with a little melancholy as guests hugged and whispered good nights. The twins, already dozing, were bundled into blankets and promised one last bedtime story. People yawned, plates were scraped, the television hummed a carol that no one seemed to hear. When the clock chose its minute, midnight came soft, almost theatrically precise. Hazel and Brandon walked to the edge of the driveway. Snow crunched underfoot. The air was an ache in the lungs, and the porch light cut a small halo around them. He had his coat buttoned up, the collar turned to guard his throat. Hazel's contract was folded in the inside pocket of the blazer she had borrowed from the spare room. It felt unnecessary and heavier than it had the day before. They did what they'd promised. Nothing dramatic, no long speeches. They thanked each other in the soft, private way people do when they have been collaborators in something that mattered more than they'd intended. He kissed her on the cheek, a precise, respectful gesture, and then he stepped back, the silhouette of his coat swallowing the porch's light as he moved toward his car. "I'll be gone," he said, short and true, "at dawn." She watched him go, the black vehicle a small dark shape against the snowy lane, until the engine's distant hum peeled the night into two halves. She stood a little longer on the porch, the emptiness already hollowing the room inside her chest, and then went back into the house to find her mother waiting with a sleepy cup of tea and a look of relief that made Hazel both grateful and infinitely small. The ride back to the city was a narrow corridor of thought. Hazel could feel the house at her back like a shape her body had been hollowed to fit. The city came up to meet her with indifferent traffic and fluorescent lights. Her apartment felt simultaneously familiar and almost foreign, like a room redecorated while she slept. The contract lay on the kitchen table, its ink a small record of the week's arrangement. She read the words again and then folded it carefully like someone returning a borrowed thing. Work came, as it always did, slowly, with the same sediment of small betrayals, petty rivalries, and the odious Mr. Henderson. He was the sort of partner who wore benevolence like armor, generous with the firm's name, stingy with the firm's ethics. In the days after Christmas, Hazel was thrust back into that world. It happened on one of those mornings that felt indistinguishable from 100 before. The soft bell at the firm's front desk, the exact hum of the HVAC, the smell of burnt coffee that seemed to be the firm's unofficial perfume. She was in a meeting with Henderson, papers fanned like crocodile teeth across the mahogany table, when she first noticed the foulness gnawing at the edges. The numbers that didn't add up, the client files with notes that felt uncomfortably prescriptive. Henderson leaned back, the sleeves of his suit pulled just so. "We have options," he murmured, the phrase a soft invitation that felt sinister by its casualness. He spoke of expediency, of bending public regulations to secure a win. "You know the way the world likes to be kept simple, Hazel. We make it simple for them." She felt her head tilt, the legal instincts in her muscles like the reflex of a bird dodging a net. "That skirts ethics," she said, calmer than she felt, because calm was how she had survived a career built on parsing nuance. "Ethics are a luxury," Henderson countered, with that paternal tone men use when they mean, "don't moralize me." "We are protecting interests. That's what clients pay for. Besides, what would you do otherwise? Help them lose their homes? Lose their jobs?" Hazel's chest tightened at the implication. She had seen people at the margins of their lives, groping for dignity as the numbers on spreadsheets decided their fates. She thought of families like the Collinses, who baked and reconciled and carried each other's burdens. To sheath the law's blade in a velvet glove felt wrong. "You taught me something once," she said, not as a rebuke, but as a point of personal history. "You once told me that the firm exists to hold people up, not to push them down. When did that change?" "It didn't," Henderson said smoothly. "We adapted, like all good firms must. We are not here to be moralists. We are here to be effective." Hazel thought of clients whose lives could not afford the cost of being effective. She imagined returning to the farm and explaining to her mother that she had traded her principles for expedience. The thought did not sit well with her. The contract in her blazer felt like the last honest page in a manila folder. She couldn't keep pretending that the firm was a place where she could apply justice as she had intended to when she took her oath. It took less than a week for things to escalate. Whispers, a takeaway meeting with a client who'd been encouraged to drop opposition, a file with forged signatures that had the familiar, clean edge of a man who believed outcomes could be engineered. Mr. Henderson smiled too much. He asked the firm to stand with a short, sharp look that demanded compliance, not judgment. Hazel did what she always did when faced with a contradiction between who she wanted to be and what was required. She wrote carefully. She composed a resignation letter as if she were constructing an argument, clear, irrefutable, courteous. She made sure to leave nothing ambiguous, no room for the firm to claim she had been negligent, no hint that she had not given them her best. The day she handed in her resignation, the office smelled of artificial citrus and stale coffee, a combination that always made her nostalgic for honest work. Henderson accepted it with the dry courtesy he afforded all inconvenient truths. "You understand the consequences," he said, and the words were more warning than fact. "I do," Hazel answered, "and I hope you'll see why." She left the office with a small box of personal items and a sense of pristine terror. Quitting was not the end of the world. She had savings, contacts, a head full of legal sense, but it felt like stepping off a cliff with only a sketch of a plan. The firm continued to hum behind her. The city swarmed like a hive that had no interest in her private rearrangements. Brandon, in the meantime, returned to his ordered life and found it had shrunk. The house in which he had kept certain rooms closed felt too spacious without the Collinses' noise, too silent without Hazel's measured laugh. He attended to obligations with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been trained in that mode, meetings, a few public appearances that required only a carefully neutral expression, the subtle art of managing influence without revealing the scaffolding. But the emptiness gnawed. False intimacy and the neat parade of polite interactions left him with a hollow that memos and investments could not fill. He found himself sketching more, simple things, houses, kitchens, hands, and each sketch felt like therapy. He had walls still, of course, but somewhere between the charcoal and the dawn, he recognized an illness in the way he had spent a life avoiding risk. He had sworn he'd keep people safe. In doing so, he'd forgotten how to take joy. One morning, the kind that hazed softly into winter and made the city seem like a thing easily rearranged, Brandon made a decision. He took 3 weeks off, not because he had a plan, but because he needed to feel how unarranged life could be. He called Hazel without theatricality. The call was simple, practical, and honest. "I'm taking time," he said. "Not away from you, away from everything else. Will you help me remember how to live?" Her answer was what he needed, a practical yes that came with a laugh and a small list of things to do. Visit a market, try a street food stand that offered something she'd never tried, sleep outside under no set schedule. She surprised him again by adding, "I might use this time to figure out what I actually want to do instead of what fills a CV." They didn't call it a breakup because what they had was never defined like that. They called it a pause and a promise, to be honest, to be accountable, to return better. The pause became a bridge. Travel, as it turned out, did not make everything tidy. It did, however, reveal small truths they both needed. They met in Lisbon first, initiative of a city that smelled of sea salt and fried dough, with tiles that made the streets feel like mosaics. There, they wandered markets where spices were piled in little domes of promise, and street vendors handed over hot custard tarts that burned their tongues in a way that felt like life. Hazel sketched in the margins of napkins. Brandon watched and laughed as she stubbornly refused to buy the cheap suede notebook he offered, insisting she prefer the thin paper of a local vendor. They moved on to a small Italian town at the edge of ruin, where a festival of lights made the night look like a living constellation. They slept in a room with no heating and lots of blankets, where the cold made them talk longer and truer. There was a ruin, a pile of stones and stories that neither of them could stop climbing. At the top, they sat like fools and argued about the best way to make a travel agency that felt honest. Not the contrived experiences on glossy pages, but slow, deliberate trips that taught you a place by letting it settle into you. Hazel drew out rough diagrams, the kind that could be made into a business plan. Brandon hummed, making notes in a voice that surprised him. He was no businessman of the standard sort, but he had patience for things he loved. In a Moroccan souk, they bartered for little things: an old map, a pair of worn leather gloves, a ring that was not for any formal promise, but for the small, private delight of a thing that fit well in a pocket. They slept under a sudden rain that made the city smell like earth and cinnamon. Hazel learned to trust small improvisations. Brandon learned to laugh without the tightness of consequence. Each place added a piece to Hazel's fledgling plan. She began sketching a boutique travel agency blueprint in earnest, curated trips that matched people not to boxes, but to secret doorways, cooking classes with widowed bakers, quiet nights with fishermen who spoke in old myths, art residencies tucked into farmhouses that smelled of hay and hot cider. She wrote mission statements with the exactness of a lawyer and the wildness of someone who remembered her father's drawing paper. Brandon listened, and then he offered the first uncomfortable thing: investment. He called it an orientation fund. He did not present it as charity. He presented it as partnership, capital with conditions about honesty, about community engagement, and, most importantly, about a refusal to spin experiences into hollow spectacles. Hazel accepted, not because she needed the money, but because she admired the trust implicit in the gesture. They were building something that required both ledger and leap. The travel months were a montage of small, tender negotiations. They argued about maps and maps of the heart. They disagreed gently and then made peace through the act of sharing a meal on a quiet, rickety balcony while the city below hummed like a living thing. Hazel learned to trust that plans could be fluid. Brandon learned that some mess didn't require containment. They tangled, they made compromises, they learned to forgive each other the small selfishnesses of two people who had been armored for a long time. The turning point was not dramatic. It was a morning on a tiny island whose coast was all cliffs and citrus trees. They walked a lonely path where goats regarded them with the disinterest of locals who had seen worse weather. The sea lay broad and astonished. Brandon carried a small paper bag with coffee for them both. They sat on a wall and watched the water, an ordinary, sacred habit they'd picked up on an early morning. And he reached into his pocket for the ring he traded for a leather glove months before, the one that wasn't manufactured for declarations and yet somehow felt right in his palm. He didn't kneel because theatrics were not his language. He didn't make promises inflated by melodrama. He laid the ring on Hazel's palm instead and said, "I don't have a script for this. I don't have a guarantee, a plan that insures us against every bad thing. I have a choice. I choose you. Not as a project, not as a contract. As the person I want my life to make room for." Hazel, who had spent a long time reducing her world to clauses and contingencies, let out a single laugh that was almost a sob. "It sounds unfair," she whispered. "I was raised to have contingencies." "So was I," he admitted. "And then I realized the only contingency worth keeping is the one that says we'll be truthful and we'll try. The rest," he gestured to the sea, the sky, the island, "is up to us." She slid the ring on with hands that trembled just enough to be honest. It fit like a found story. In that small, unspectacular ceremony, the contract they'd written in the supermarket was eclipsed by something with no clause and no neat end date at all. They returned home months later with a new rhythm. Hazel opened the agency in a sunlit office that smelled of coffee and new paper. It was modest, with a bookshelf of hand-picked travel tales and a single photo of the Collins farmhouse tucked behind a small succulent. Brandon sat in the corner of her office more often than necessary, a steady presence that felt more like a lighthouse than a fortress. He invested not only money, but time. He sat in focus groups, listened to bakers, negotiated with local hosts, and learned to pitch without elbowing respect out of the room. Hazel's old life didn't disappear. The firm kept humming, the city kept demanding. But she found a new way to carry herself into the courtroom when she had to. Less like a warrior and more like someone who had learned the shape of mercy. She made one conscientious choice after another. She took pro bono cases. She refused to work with clients who wanted to manipulate law into cruelty. She rebuilt the professional perimeter that fit her ethics. It was a slower grind than public ambition, but it felt like building a house with windows that let light through. There were setbacks, as there always are when real people try to build honest things. A host pulled out last minute, a cynical investor doubted the business model. A miscommunication left a group of travelers disappointed. But there were also wins that felt like family. A small group returned from a trip to a rural village insisting they had been transformed. A baker sent a letter about how an outsider's visit had helped keep an old recipe alive. Those letters were the currency Hazel learned to treasure. A year later, the Collins farmhouse prepared for Christmas with a different kind of bustle. Hazel and Brandon arrived, not as performers, but as family members whose presence had come with a history. The twins were a few years older and still efficient in their delight. Aunt Carol had found new ways to make toast with more than mere ritual. Mrs. Collins had added a new chutney to the table. The house smelled like firewood and citrus peels, the exact scent of ordinary miracle. That Christmas Eve they gathered as before, but without the contract folded in a blazer. Hazel had no need for legal ink to validate her place at the table. Family had accepted the strange man with the cedar smoke cologne, and in return, Brandon had woven himself into the house's stories without erasing them. After dessert, a ceremonial arrangement of sweet things they ate with forks and reckless gratitude, Brandon stood. There was the small intake of breath family members used to when seeing someone they loved try on speech. He cleared his throat, the kind of sound that meant something essential was about to be said. "I promised you all last year a performance," he began, glancing at Hazel with a warmth that made her chest ache. "What I didn't say then is that the performance taught me something I wasn't willing to learn from any other teacher. That there's a kind of courage in being present. Hazel showed me that." Aunt Carol clapped before he could finish, and the rest of the room followed with that peculiar, fierce family applause that meant you were included no matter what you'd done to earn it. Brandon smiled briefly at them all, then produced, like a man who had spent a career learning how to stage small, meaningful acts, a napkin and a fountain pen. Hazel's heart did something both vivid and private when she saw him unscrew the pen. He didn't pull out a legal document, he didn't pull out a clause. Instead, he scribbled a few lines, messy, sincere, and then slid the napkin to Hazel. She read it aloud, a laugh breaking into her voice. "I, Brandon Moretti, promise to prioritize chaos, laughter, and daily courage." Aunt Carol clapped before he could finish, and the rest of the room followed with that peculiar, fierce family applause that meant you were included no matter what you'd done to earn it. Brandon smiled briefly at them all, then produced, like a man who had spent a career learning how to stage small, meaningful acts, a napkin and a fountain pen. Hazel's heart did something both vivid and private when she saw him unscrew the pen. He didn't pull out a legal document, he didn't pull out a clause. Instead, he scribbled a few lines, messy, sincere, and then slid the napkin to Hazel. She read it aloud, a laugh breaking into her voice. "I, Brandon Moretti, promise to prioritize chaos, laughter, and daily courage. I promise to keep the coffee hot for at least one of us on mornings we both forget. I promise to sign no contract that makes love into a number. I promise to be present." The room erupted. Mrs. Collins wiped a tear with the back of her hand, like that was what napkins were invented for. Hazel found herself laughing and crying at once, and she reached for Brandon's hand. They stood together, and the house seemed to breathe with them, the way old wood takes in new songs. Later, as snow fell soft and precise outside, they sat in the living room with the twins asleep, and the family dispersed into pleasant after-dinner grogginess. Brandon leaned forward and took Hazel's hands between his. "You changed me," he said simply, the admission not like a trophy, but like a relief. "You changed me too," she answered. "You showed me that sometimes a contract isn't the only way to keep promises." He kissed her then, not under mistletoe, not for the family spectacle, but because the room had become small enough to hold both past and future. The kiss felt like a folding of pages, of two complicated lives now bound at the spine. In the quiet that followed, Hazel thought of the grocery store with its fluorescent lights, of the whispered "pretend you're with me" that had sounded like a dare and a blessing. She thought of contracts written in the neat legal hand she'd been raised to admire, and of the napkin that had now become the truest thing she owned, a promise without legalese, a vow of presence. Outside, the farm settled into snow and silence. Inside, there were the small domestic noises of a house alive, the scrape of a chair, the soft clink of a cup, the distant hum of a car on the road. Hazel and Brandon sat close, their fingers threaded, a simple, unadorned union that had evolved without the need for a clause to sanctify it. If you loved this story, like and subscribe, and tell us which holiday romance trope you'd like to see next.